All right, let's get started. We're here for the Finance Committee, November 13th, 2023. I'll start off by moving to approve the minutes of the October 30th, 2023 meeting.
Second.
All right, and since there's no one else, that is stand approved. So we have one ordinance here, and the administration was kind enough to indulge us in some changes and revisions to ordinance number 18-2023, which will establish new purchasing limits in line with the Ohio Revised Code for the City of Lakewood. At first reading on September 5th, 2023, second reading on September 18th, 2023, and would have its third reading at the upcoming, well, probably had its third reading at the last council meeting. No, it hasn't because it's with us. Yeah, we'll have its third reading at the next council meeting, if referred out of committee. Thank you, Maureen. I'm still getting a hang of the process. Now, Director Vargo, in conjunction with members of the administration, worked very hard over the past month to make revisions based on conversations that were had at the last Finance Committee meeting. And we do really appreciate that. And at this time, so we're all discussing, we're all on the same page, I would move to substitute the version that's on Granicus, which is called EEV, which I'm assuming Ernie has a middle name of E. Revisions bid per council comments November 9th, 2023 as a substitute for 18-2023.
Okay, second the motion.
All right. Any discussion on that? We got discussion afterwards. All right. That is seconded, and since we're the only two people here in finance, that is stand approved. I will briefly go over the changes made due to our discussion and some reservations from members of council in that version. One, members of the committee at the last meeting did express some reservations about it being tied to ORC Section 917, those limits, which is $75,000, but also has a inflation tie-in, which would be raised by, was it 2% every year, or inflation? Was that right?
Thank you,
Director
Mr.
Vargo?
Chairman. I believe it's 3%.
3%? Okay. So that has been changed to be just in excess of $75,000. So it's no longer tied to the ORC. There was some cleanup, and also in terms of departmental contracts, we made a change that instead of $7,500, that purchases in excess of 50, blah, 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 council. Actually, let me just have Director Vargo, since he's probably prepared a whole thing, to go over the changes from the administration, and I'll let him do that.
Sure.
And I just have him sit here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you indicated, this was a proposed ordinance, and the administration received input from members of the committee and has attempted to account for those comments and that input. Specifically, several meetings among the Finance Department and Public Works with how we can reach a resolution and apply the input of council and still have an efficient process. So you're correct, Mr. Chair. The result of this was the first proposed ordinance had bidding obligations kicking in at above $75,000 with an inflation adjustment of 3% each year. As a result of input, this proposed substitute takes that to $75,000 and omits any allowance for inflation adjustment. The second material change is with respect to Board of Control. The original ordinance proposed Board of Control begin above $75,000 to match the bidding limit as set forth in the revised code. Based on input and discussion with committee members and internally with finance and other departments, the proposed substitute takes that Board of Control limit down to $50,000. So the administration will undertake the Board of Control with the council's representative for contracts and purchases in excess of $50,000. Now, that's the substance, and I think we're able to reach a compromise on that substance. There's no question that the administration, the departments would like the added flexibility that was set forth in the original ordinance. Perhaps council would have wanted even less than where we are today, but I think the process has worked. Everybody has worked in good faith, and I believe hopefully the compromise reflects a very effective ordinance for the city, for the people. There are two process items that there has been extensive discussion on, and that is a request by council that for the contracts that don't reach $75,000, that the Director of Finance prepare written internal controls that will be applied to the analysis of those purchases and those agreements. That was input and request by the committee, considered and reviewed by the Finance Department and others, and that finds its way in the second. That compromise finds its way in the substitute version before you now. So this version provides that the Department of Finance will apply internal controls to those contracts less than $75,000 and provide an outline of those controls to council in the budget pursuant to the budget process. That allows council to review the controls, to ask questions about it, and to give approval to those controls. Now, the second, I misspoke. Director Rankator is telling me the internal controls will be applied to the purchases up to $50,000. And that is because
Well, the ordinance says up to.
yes, no, I had that right. I'll ask Director Rankator to not confuse an old man over here. I had that right. The Board of Controls is not applicable to this provision. Thank you for physically alerting me to that, Mr. Chairman, by your confusion. Okay, so those controls will be set forth in the budget and considered and approved by council. The second procedural item requested by the committee members was a monthly report, and this does relate to the Board of Controls. And so the substitute version requires the Department of Finance to prepare a monthly report to be submitted to council for any purchases or contracts up to the amount of $50,000. This was the confusion earlier. This applies up to $50,000 on the theory that anything greater than $50,000 will be subject to Board of Control. So this is an additional item for transparency for council to receive the monthly report. Now, Director Rankator is prepared to answer any questions on the internal controls with respect to purchases under $75,000 and the monthly report with respect to purchases under $50,000. But just for the sake of this presentation, among the items that will be included in the monthly report are the name of the vendor, an invoice number, the amount of the invoice, a brief description of the purchase, the date of the payment, and like I said, the amount of the payment and the vendor name, which will be the payee. So that information will be supplied to council on a monthly basis by finance as a recognition that the Board of Control will start at $50,000. That was pursuant to the request of the committee, which was considered duly and in good faith by the Finance Department. Yes. Okay. Okay.
A lot of numbers here and a lot of for everything that is greater than $50,000 up to you don't have to go out to bid. Or if anything was above $7,500, you would have to go out to bid. So there would be a record in front of the Board of Control. Board of Control meets on schedule. There's agendas, there's minutes. The best practice in the past has posted contracts that are granted through the Board of Control. So there is opportunity for the public to make under $50,000, you won't need to go to Board of Control. You won't need legislation. Most large cities practice combining there will be a forthcoming this is kind of a protection
Decades, I believe, Mr. Chairman.
So who knows what can happen in the meantime. So this provides that. And of course, I recognize it is really a back and forth with people administration always the right to anybody who is in the administration want as much as possible. And that always runs city councils, charter responsibility of the overseers in charge of the budget of do the best we can to be informed of aid us and monthly basis as proposed by willing to make it less than for flexibility than what
Following it on that, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that description. It's very helpful. I kind of understood how things were going up to this point. That you illustrated very well how this works, I think, or is supposed to work. To that point, you know, up to 50,000, any purchase up to 50,000 will be reported. Would that include even small purchases, like say made a small order of a jacket, an embroidered jacket? Would that $100 purchase be included? Have to be included on that list? And I would just add that up to this point, 7,500 and below wasn't really, it hasn't been sort of tracked up to this point. So there'd be something that's new, I think. And if it's not being tracked, that might be a good floor to kind of consider, because again, it seems to be that's modus operandi, and there's no real, I don't think there's any real concern or problem with that being at least a limit there. So
Good point. Thank you. Well, I think there's just some brief other changes made. If we could just go over those. Or let's
Yeah, that's fine,
point on
Mr. Chair. I've
those.
got one or two thoughts that haven't been raised so far. I'm sympathetic to the motion you seem to be ready to make. But just, you're saying you want the director to proceed?
Well, if you have something on the.
No.
point.
I can wait. I can wait.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, before you go to the next procedural issue on this, if I can just speak to the point about the proposed amendment and the placing of the, or to communicating about the report on the council docket, and just give some potential issues to think about as you consider your motion.
Well, if we can do that when we circle back to the amendment, we could talk about that when the amendment's proposed. I think that would be a good time, if that's okay, if we can just continue with.
That's fine,
next
thank
change.
you.
Right, thank you. Well, sorry, Director Varga, are there any, I think there's some minor changes beyond, after that new section, what was it, section 5? I believe were there any other amendments to, I believe 11.04, that was a change. There's really no other changes to the ordinance from the last time,
There's nothing,
substantive at least.
yeah, if there's a change, it's not material.
Okay. Good. Now, circling back, I'll get to you in a second, Director. So I'm going to, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out, I'm going to propose an amendment to Section 5, and we're going to do it pretty piecemeal, so we have a chance to discuss and everybody has an opportunity to rebut or provide context to, unless Tom wants to
Sure,
say something.
I've got some unrelated, I've got two
Shoot, go
small
ahead.
things and one or two big things. So thank you for the discussion, Mr. Chair. Thank you to my colleagues for working on this, and to the administration for coming forward with, now, I don't know, we're on version 1. We're on version 2, probably, it's fair to say. I also agree with the spirit that there's a need to update this and also to provide the ability to move in a timely fashion. I think the example from the Fleet Division is a very practical and timely and pertinent example, and so I'm glad that we're discussing this. A couple thoughts. First, or actually a couple of minor questions. On the top of page 4, it says substantially, okay, it says the Department of Finance shall submit to council at least on a monthly basis report. of contracts or purchases in amounts less than $50,000 containing information substantially similar as set forth in a form filed with the clerk of council. I don't know what that form is. I'm not sure what that refers to. Do we have a form that we're using now? Is that the idea?
Thank you, Councilman. We do not have a form. This is a form developed by the Finance Department in response to input
Okay.
from the committee, and it will have the line items that I described
Sure.
earlier.
So,
with
so what does that mean, the form filed with the clerk of council? Is there, that's a future thing to be developed, is that the idea?
Yes, it's in the
Okay,
process
correct,
of being
okay.
developed, Councilman, and on a monthly basis, it's estimated to be
Okay.
anywhere from 15 to 25 pages.
Okay, very good. So that answers my immediate question. The second thing is another minor point on page 8. There's reference to publishing in a newspaper in general circulation in Cuyahoga County, so that we're, in this section, pursuing our due diligence on essentially advertising contracts for services and work for a construction manager. I seem to recall language avoiding newspapers given in the last 4 or 5 years. One of your predecessors, Director, came up with alternate language that I'm struggling to recall right now, but the idea is maybe we don't use newspapers. Maybe newspapers are an overly specific way, and there was alternate language like in, shall advertise broadly or something like that. I can't find that now, but it might be better drafting if we consider some alternative. That's a quibble. But I do know that that's in the code somewhere. I'm wondering if Assistant Director Swallow might recall what I'm thinking of. It's a minor point. The third thing is a bigger point that I'd like to raise, and that is I noticed that the proposal includes expanding from 4, or is it 5 current members of the Board of Control. Okay, wait a minute, there's 5. The current Board of Control is comprised of the Mayor, Director of Law, Director of Finance, Director of Public Works. That's 4. Is that correct? Okay, so then this would potentially expand it to Director of Planning and Development, Director of Human Services, and the Director of Human Resources, or the Procurement Officer upon approval by Council. So that is, I think, 7. Now, I'd be curious to understand why, what's the merits of that? No? Is that not an accurate reading?
Well,
Or do you not want to get into this right now?
well,
Mr.
it looks,
Chairman?
no, it does. Sorry if I could jump in. It looks like they are adding members, but I know most cities do have pretty large membership of the Board of Control. Usually contains nearly all directors. But I think a benefit.
That's on
Director of
page
Planning,
4.
yeah, I see.
In section, no, excuse me, it's on page 3, section 4.
Yeah, it's B2.
And it also
If I-
appears somewhere else. Go ahead, Matt.
If I could, and my understanding is Director Vargo looks at this, is there's not a desire to expand the Board of Control. It's well-suited is where it is. My understanding is that this is just to allow any of these directors to enter into the contract. So
Okay.
many times they come to my desk. It just allows for the directors to enter the contract.
Okay, so I just
Correct.
misread
So
that section.
It's under awarding authority, yeah.
Okay. I did want to plant one, okay, and then it appears again on page 9 in section B12, although I'm not sure what the code is. It says, in the case of contract awarded pursuant to section 11102, the mayor, director, public works, finance director, et cetera. Boy, I'm not sure I can parse that on the fly here. What, is that the same,
On
though?
page 9?
Page 9, right, at the
Yeah, that's
top.
just saying that who the awarding authority is. That means who's the
Okay.
contract to pay your.
The proposal is not to do what I thought, which is to change, okay. I do want to plant this seed. I would welcome the opportunity for a member of council to be a member of the Board of Control. And I don't know if that's ever been discussed before. And my colleague is maybe signaling that that's not a typical structure. But I just want to express that desire because in terms of the practicalities of daily spending and revenues in the city, I think that the Board of Control and the directors have vastly more practical discretion over spending than council, which in the charter is the authority over the budget. But in practical terms, what we do is we discuss during the, we're going to do it in the next several weeks, the forthcoming budget. It's all done on macro level, and there's huge discretion afforded to the directors on the programmatic and micro level and the contract level. So increasing city council or a city council member's engagement in the Board of Control would not have if you had a member, you would not have a majority at all, but you would increase the information flow. The other alternative, of course, is you could remove from the annual appropriations ordinances the discretion granted to directors, because in practicality, there's a lot of spending that happens that city council doesn't know about or hear about, and I do think that's worth our redressing. Or to me, I'd like to see more practical consultation with city council, and if we're not doing that legislatively, I'm interested in other tools. So that's where I'm coming from in that proposal. Thanks. I know that's a big topic that may not be workable in the next few minutes here, but I want to, on the record, express that.
I mean, thank you, Tom. I mean, without getting too deep in the weeds, I do appreciate the desire to be more involved in the day-to-day and where the money goes, because that is in council's purview about how money is spent in programming. But I think that taking that step is kind of a separation of powers type of thing, because the way I see it is we are making, so council appropriates, we're appropriators, and then administration are the implementers. So all the money that Board of Control is approving is money that we already approved and appropriated for certain purposes. All they're doing in terms of Board of Control is picking the exact contractor, vendor, supplier that is carrying out the money.
And putting quality controls on the expenditure before it is final. I understand that concept. And so so your feedback is that this is the wrong tool, I gather from, I gather that's what the
Right, and it's not like we can't legislate this service shall be provided by X contractor.
You could, though, have an ex officio member council, a non-voting ex officio member council. Even if that's not desirable, then if the feedback is, okay, we don't want to go in that direction, then the city council, according to the charter and according to long-standing municipal government tradition, would then, if it wants more control and more hands-on and more decision on how money is spent and what amounts are spent on what, then we should therefore seek that in our legislation and our appropriations ordinances, right?
That could be through the appropriations ordinance. It could be through other ordinance, not even during budget season, but directing that certain amounts are directed to certain projects. I mean, and I would also note that Board of Control meetings are open meetings. They're public. They can be attended.
Yep, and that was an improvement that happened in some of my early years. Originally, the Board of Control meetings were not very well publicized, and so council members didn't even have the opportunity. We have had a recent tradition, meaning the last 10 years, of having council staff go and report regularly, and that's been, I think, helpful. That's a report, and so that's a meaningful step. But
I appreciate the discussion on that.
okay, thanks.
All right. All right. Let's circle back. I'm going to do on Section 5. So I'm going to make a quick amendment just to the title, because I think the recommendation by my colleague, Mr. Baker, it was an app recommendation, doesn't really change much, but I think it describes what we're doing in that section a little better. So I will move to amend Section 5 of the substitute, the title, to read Department of Finance Reports / Internal Controls. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Any discussion, any thoughts from the administration on that one?
No, that's fine, Mr. Chair, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, why don't we actually vote?
I was gonna vote on
Okay,
that.
all right, sorry.
Well, okay, all those in favors?
Aye.
All right, that's us, that's it. All right, so now for Section A, and we'll get into a discussion here. Director Vargo, I would move to amend Section 5, subsection A, to read, to insert after suppliers on line 3 and/or a competitive process, and then on line 4, after controls, insert and/or competitive process, and in line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, after controls, insert and/or competitive process. Do I have, processes, sorry, processes will be in, and make it plural on section 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or 6, line 4 and 6. It will make sense in a second. Just give me a minute on this.
Okay, second, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, let me explain, and then Director Vargo, I'll call on you. So, it's line 5. Let me count. Just for the record, so Maureen knows what we're talking about. Line 3, it just says and/or competitive process. Line 4, and/or competitive processes. And line 5, 6, and/or competitive processes. Now, this is, so this is kind of dictating what will be included in those internal controls for amounts that are $75,000 and less, or up to purchases, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. Apply to specific internal controls for contracts or purchases, $75,000 or less. Now, so it will include a canvassing of qualified available suppliers, that's good, and/or a competitive process, and that will be outlined in the budget book. Now, because it says and/or, that means they could either have also outline a competitive process in there that they will use, or they could decide just to have the canvassing of qualified suppliers. I think by inserting this, in my opinion, those people can disagree. I do not think it's saying one version is better than the other. I think there is an understanding that there are different needs for different types of supplies or types of services where a competitive process doesn't make sense, where just a canvassing or otherwise getting quotes makes more sense. Sometimes there's only a single supplier. Sometimes there's only one person that could provide, or one entity that could provide a particular service. You often see that in the tech world, where there's a very limited number of bodies that can provide certain services. So this gives the finance director the discretion to either outline a competitive process or how they will canvass for qualified suppliers in the budget book when they speak on the internal controls they're going to have.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
So the competitive process means, it could mean, but it more likely means something other than a bid.
Correct. It's not a formal bid process.
Okay.
It,
but
it
was-
does not mean bid, because otherwise we would say a bidding,
Yeah, understood.
competitive bid.
So that's after the word suppliers on line 3. after-
Controls on 4 and controls on 6. The last line.
Okay, the last line. Okay, I understand the motion.
Director Vargo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question is the added language necessary? And we just, the Law Department just requests that the committee respectfully consider the following, because this is truly a drafting issue. We are describing what the controls are by this language. It is the controls that matter. They will speak for themselves. When we try to describe what those controls say, we invite risk. For instance, a competitive process. Just let's talk about that in isolation. Respectfully, that is a subjective term. It is subject to interpretation. A disgruntled vendor is likely to have a different interpretation of what a competitive process is than what the city will have. It could lead to argument. Councilmember Bullock, you said, so a formal bid is not required to meet a competitive process. That's a subjective opinion. That ultimately would be determined by a judge because it is subjective. We have a bidding process laid out in the bidding ordinance that goes through advertised bids. Anything less than that could be argued by a disgruntled vendor as not competitive, because obviously we intend the bidding process as laid out in the ordinance to be competitive. We subject ourselves to argument for no reason, because the controls that the finance director will apply speak for themselves. They will be set forth for council in the budget to review, to ask questions about, to accept, to reject on an annual basis. And it's the application of those controls that will be at issue. Whenever we, simply for drafting purposes, decide to characterize those, we invite a challenge to the extent somebody doesn't agree with our characterization, and they will claim that our controls, therefore, were not a competitive process. The point is, there is risk. However you want to quantify that risk, it's there. And it's just seemingly unnecessary because it is the controls that will matter, not how we describe them. So I will say this, that the second point is when we set forth the bidding elements in the bid ordinance, I believe that's a competitive process. I think we all would. We don't refer to it in the bid ordinance as a competitive process. Why? Why subjectively characterize it as a competitive process? The bidding procedure is what it is. It is set forth. There's no characterization. In fact, the only time the city says the word competitive in its bidding ordinance is to identify when competitive bids are not required, and that's in the exceptions. So the only time the prior drafters of the bidding ordinance said the word competitive is when they are saying competitive bidding is not necessary in the following instances. But when they're describing the bidding procedures, they let the bidding procedures speak for themselves, and they don't characterize it as competitive or otherwise. The law department thinks that that is prudent drafting. If it's not necessary to characterize it, and characterizing it invites some degree of risk, we can debate what that degree is, but there is some risk, then as a matter of drafting, the law department would recommend we not use that language. The controls are what they are. Why describe it? Why invite risk? So that's the consideration. And listen, we don't have a monopoly on drafting in the law department. We benefit in the law department from having lawyers on council in many respects. I'm not saying anybody's drafting is better than the other, but the law department owns this language. If we find ourselves in court in 3 years, 5 years, arguing whether we applied a competitive process, that will be the law department's language. Nobody is going to say, well, that was council's language. It's ours, we own it. So our drafting recommendation would be to delete it as unnecessary. Now, to address the and/or language, because we had very good faith discussions about this, and it led to the and/or. And so the question, and I respect the chair very much when he says, this allows, okay, if we don't do what some people would describe as a competitive process, that's okay, because it says or. And that is technically correct. Technically correct. But if the language adds nothing and it increases risk, why even have it as an alternative or? No, the law department does not want to stand up in court and its first argument say, Judge, we did not have to have a competitive process because it says or. We don't like to characterize what we're doing as not a competitive process, even though sometimes it'll lead to just a single quote. So all of that is to say, we respectfully do not believe this language adds much or anything, but it potentially increases risks. So we just felt it was important for you to hear that from the law department as you consider this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, first, I don't know if you want to respond first. I have some thoughts or questions.
Thinking.
Okay. So thank you, Director Vargo. I think I follow the feedback, which is be intentional, be precise in legal drafting, make sure to minimize, pardon me, the potential for litigation to get some teeth and create problems. And that's valid feedback. The couple thoughts. So first of all, I think if I follow the amendment, I think the concept is to add rigor to the section here, because what the overall ordinance proposes to do is change significantly the current controls on spending, with that spending threshold and with the change requirements for the threshold for which competitive bidding is required. So that in many ways is an expansion of discretion and a reduction of checks and balances, for lack of a better term. So in considering that, and I agree that that's warranted at this point, given that it's been many years, we, from a council member's perspective, it's also desirable to make sure that we have rigorous checks and balances in place. I hear that the administration is saying that it thinks you've got the right language here. I also respect the perspective, since I'm in that role, of a council member and some of my colleagues saying, okay, we want to enhance beyond what's presented by the administration in this draft by adding some rigor to it. So I think that's the spirit of it. That would be the answer to your question, why add language, okay? So if the language proposed in the amendment, in the motion, is insufficiently clear, one way to potentially resolve that would be to add specificity to the terminology, add clarity to the definition. To your point, it's an undefined term, or it's a vague term. It's a term of art potentially described elsewhere in law or in case law or the code or our code. So you don't want to use the term competitive imprecisely. Is that capture part of the spirit of what you're saying?
With one clarification,
Yep.
Councilman, through the chair. The language you suggested adds rigor, and that's the intent of council, which is to be respected. But the language does not add rigor, technically.
Mm-hmm.
It is nothing more than a characterization of what the rigor already is in the form of the controls. It is the controls and the application of them by the finance department that is the rigor. there's nothing added by this language. It is merely describing what Director Rankator's team will be doing.
Yeah, I did hear that in your earlier comments. I understand that that's your view and your advice. So, but I think the intent of the proposal is to create an additional category. So you could have some administrative controls. The finance director, who we're using his name in vain as he sits right here. Love to hear from Director Rankator. So the finance director, he or she, or they could potentially define and will update annually to be approved or incorporated by council in the annual budget, which is a good process. That could be an administrative process that looks a certain way. A competitive process using not a legal term, but just a common sense dictionary term, could be something else, could be something additional. Now, it sounds as if you anticipate that the financial controls that the finance department would define could include that too, or could encompass what I'm describing. But I think that it would add rigor if we clarify that the financial control, or we specify that the financial controls.
I'll jump in real quick.
Okay, you're going to jump in, but I've got one other question. It's just, can't a litigious, disgruntled vendor sue the city anyway, even if it's just for those financial controls? Frankly, they can sue us for saying, "Have a nice day." You know, people can sue for anything. Now, I get your point that you don't want to make it easy for to invite lawsuits and add the likelihood to their lawsuit that it might actually get a favorable ruling. But is, I mean, is that really the case here?
Councilman, thank you for that. I think as you describe the issues, gets to the heart of the point. When you say, based on your review, you're talking about the controls, and implicit in your discussion and question is that a competitive process could be interpreted different from the controls. Maybe add an added step, add rigor. That's the worry here, that a vendor makes the case, makes the argument that there was something else besides these controls that needed to be applied. And that's what the statute or ordinance describes as, quote, a competitive process. And the vendor will argue there was no competitive process in a unique situation where perhaps we only had a single supplier. So, Councilman, when you're contemplating a different meaning of competitive process and our controls, that's the very issue we're concerned about, because they have to be one and the same. It's only the controls that are going to apply here, nothing more. And they're going to be significant, and they're going to be according to accounting principles. And the director has worked on those. That's what the director will be applying.
You could change and/or to or. That would solve it. Or you could specify in a separate sentence that this finance director's controls shall include, and then specify something. But I'm sorry, I interrupted the chairman's earlier desire to speak here.
This is the way I see the intent and the purpose of section 11, new section 11.03, is that it is describing council's desire of what they want to see as a floor in the internal controls for the contracts of purchases that are less than $75,000. It is not mandating that there is a section in the budget book that reads competitive process controls and a list, or canvassing. It's a descriptor of what council's desire is to see in. So council, when the budget book comes out, can point to and have better reason to state that the internal controls of some future finance director are not sufficient to comply with the ordinance. I don't see it as, respectfully, I don't see it the same way as Director Vargo does, as a bludgeon to be used by a vendor to say your process that you used was not competitive enough. Sure, they may have, I believe a vendor would only really have a articulable claim if they looked at the internal controls in the budget book, as in the budget, because this is what this points to, and says the controls used in the budget book as described were not fulfilled. So that is my thoughts on that. Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. If I may, it seems to basically boil down to, is council comfortable moving forward with language that the law department deems unnecessary and unnecessarily opens this up to potential litigation? I mean, that's basically what I see as a question. Are you comfortable with the language that unnecessarily opens up the city to be litigated against a bidder who is unhappy with the outcome? I will tell you through experience, we've already had times when bidders have even questioned processes. So I don't, my take, but it's the council's decision, why would we provide this opportunity to have someone litigate, again, unnecessarily? But that's your decision on the language.
Thank you, Mayor. And I would say on two fronts, I think I'm comfortable with the language. I think the risk is minimal. And I think I do strongly believe that what this does is provide a floor of what council wants to see as what the internal controls are. It doesn't define the internal controls. It says internal controls must reach a certain level. It's a directive to the finance director to include in their budget book internal controls that meet a certain threshold. And council could go back to this ordinance and say, this section, and say, those internal controls either do meet this threshold or they don't. That's how I see it.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
two questions. One is, what about the thought by this non-attorney that and/or in your amendment, your proposed amendment be changed to or? Does that improve anything from the perspective of either you or the law director?
Well, that would mean you could only
Okay.
mandates the inclusion of canvassing or an inclusion of a competitive process. It could be read to be one over the other, absent one.
Okay.
So I would leave it. And this could, of course, be debated more at the regular meeting.
The other thought I had is that, you know, maybe there's time between now and next Monday for the law department and the committee chair to confer to get further specificity on the terms. So, for example, if the law department's view is that the terms are vague and invite legal ambiguity, which is not to be desired, can't that easily enough be resolved by adding more terminology or defining the term? Or is it your view that that's not desirable?
I mean, I think as a chair, I'd be open to that. But at this point, I'll just call this amendment to a vote.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, so could we get to the agreement that, so we're potentially going to vote on the motion, you know, what's the intent tonight in the committee? Are we going to keep it in committee? I mean, I think what we could do is make some headway tonight, bring it back in a week. Finance Committee's already noticed for next Monday, and we have a full council meeting. I don't know what the desire is in terms of trying to, so in other words, we could have the best of both worlds. We could make some progress tonight and then see if there's some opportunity to get on much of this difference of view resolved. Is that an approach that we could take?
That's fine. I will
So we
withdraw the
could
motion
vote-
for now.
No, that's not what I meant. We could approve the motion, keep the proposed ordinance in committee, which would allow an opportunity for any further changes to
Okay.
be
We could do that.
worked before it's reported out.
Yeah. I hear you.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
We do that.
So,
All those in favor of the amendment?
aye.
All right.
Okay.
There is one more if you would allow me 5 or 6 minutes, Mr. President.
5 or 6, go ahead.
Up to 10 to 20. So I will move on same section 5, division B, to add after line 1 of division B, delete A after basis, replace with as a communication on the council docket, A, and then at line 1, 2, 3, 4, after council, but shall at least contain the date, amount, the payee, and a brief description of the purchase/services. So the amendment would read in full.
Are you
section-
on page 9, Mr. Chair?
I don't know what page I'm on. I'm on section, the same section, but division B.
Oh, okay.
So it would read, the Department of Finance shall submit to council on at least a monthly basis as a communication on the council docket, a report of contracts, purchases, and amounts less than $50,000 containing information substantially similar as set forth in the form filed with clerk of council, but shall at least contain the date, amount, payee, and a brief description of the purchase/services.
Second.
Second. Any discussion on that point?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be brief, knowing
Sure.
that we have another week. And again, I appreciate all the discussions we had, Mr. Chair. They've been in good faith, and I think we're getting to a very effective piece of legislation. On this, issues to consider would be under the unamended proposed substitute. The Department of Finance is providing a report with the items that the chairman referenced. Council will have that report to review, to ask questions of the administration, to schedule a committee meeting, to put it on your own docket. This ordinance is unusual in that it is requiring another branch of government to put something on another branch's docket when it's council that controls its own docket. The council operates its docket according to your rules that you apply, but we're making a codification of a requirement that the executive branch put something on your docket. When you control your own docket, you will have this report. You can put it on the docket as you see fit. Regarding, I think it was the original meeting, Mr. Chairman, you referenced transparency, and everybody is in favor of transparency, and everybody focuses on that, and we believe it. If transparency can be included by having the monthly report, not just provided to council, but by putting on the web page of the city, for example, to increase transparency. That's something the administration does with other items. It could put on its web page the monthly report, can include it. It just strikes us as unusual, or strikes the department as unusual, that one branch of government is being required to put something on another branch's docket that is controlled by that other branch pursuant to rule, not by codification. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also adjust that amendment. Let me go back and open up that amendment to add after in line 2, amounts greater than $7,500 and. So between $7,500 and $50,000. Mr. Bullock, did you have something on that?
Okay, second.
Second, sure.
May we repeat the full?
So now it reads, the Department of Finance shall submit to council on at least a monthly basis as a communication on the council docket, a report of contracts or purchases in amounts greater than $7,500 and less than I don't know if it's and or but. We'll figure that out. But less than $50,000 containing information substantially similar as set forth in the form filed with the clerk of council, but shall at least contain the date, the amount, the payee, and a brief description of the purchase services.
Okay, and I seconded that motion. I'm happy to support it. And Director Vargo, I appreciate the points you're raising about separation of powers, and is this excessively rigorous, or is it more detailed than is customary? I guess I err in favor of transparency here, which I know was the intent of the administration. And I was having a sideline with Councilman Rader. A communication to the clerk, as proposed in the unamended version, is a public record. What is proposed in the motion is also a public record, but it would be promulgated in a public meeting. In fact, our most public meeting, City Council's most public meeting of all, which is a full council meeting. It would be on the council agenda. It would be easy to find on a consistent and regular basis. I mean, you know, I find that pretty compelling. Maybe the detail can be it's essentially a spreadsheet. Maybe there needs to be a version or language that says redacting those expenditures that would not be a public record, you know, because there is, but we don't have to get into that tonight, especially if we're going to, I think the intent is to bring it back in a week, right?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, those are some considerations, but that's the spirit that I think I'm hearing from my colleagues. I share it myself, so in some response. Now, if there's additional legal drafting to consider, I certainly respect that, but that's all I had to say, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate those comments.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, sure.
if I could just add, you know, perhaps we codify some of the controls mentioned, the payee, the amount, the date, what have you, just to make sure you get that full report, but not codify it in the council docket, because that does seem to be quite different from any other reports that we do provide council. For instance, you get the monthly financial report emailed monthly. You get the annual police report emailed monthly. If council wishes to really dig into a certain a vendor or cost, then they have the ability to review it and then have a thorough, thoughtful discussion on the issue at hand. Another thought is, my thoughts are it might be easier for the public to find a document under the finance page, under monthly, you know, whatever we end up calling it, under $50,000 threshold by month, rather than someone searching through, you know, a 100-page docket. Perhaps, you know, it's on the first of the month one month, it's on the second Monday the next month, maybe it's delayed due to timing, so you're having people fumbling through dockets looking for it. But if it's easily identifiable on the website, I think that might provide some more transparency if that's the overall goal.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that. And I would say that, and I think we would all welcome that in addition to this report. And there are other, I mean, I think it's analogous to other things that council receives that are codified that council does receive. For example, when a gift or a grant is provided to the Division of Police or Division of Fire, that has to be communicated to City Council through a communication on the docket, not through an email. It has to be on the docket. And I think it's my position that we are transitioning the city from having everything above $7,500 go out to bid in a very public way. And I think this is a fair compromise in a transition where we're now upwards of $75,000 doesn't have to go up to bid to provide a public in a way that they're assured that City Council is seeing this on their docket, in public, on the agenda, where it's $7,500 through $50,000, where the residents of Lakewood can be assured that City Council is also reviewing. There's another set of eyes on it, because we do have Board of Control having another set of eyes between $50,000 and $75,000. So that's my position on, yes.
I just have one thought, just because I think that floor is a good idea. I mean, I would welcome the administration's thoughts on that, but just to kind of keep things the way they are in terms of what we're doing with things below $7,500, cleaning that report up so it's a less, for us to have to pick through and all that kind of stuff. But also, like, I don't know what process got us to the 50,000 where it is and the 75,000 where it is. My thought process is why not make them both either 75,000 or both 50,000 just to make the thing more streamlined. And I'll defer to those that work for city governments in finance, or I think these controls make a lot of sense. But just curious as to how that happened, if it's some kind of compromise that I'm unaware of. But
I would say, thank you, that's a good question. That $50,000 threshold, in my experience, has been for professional services, and a lot of purchases and supplies has been a threshold for many large to mid-sized cities to not have any extra oversight over through a board of control. And originally, by capping both, the original plan was to cap everything, or have the $75,000, which is what is tied into the ORC. So this provides kind of this is a compromise that allows administration a number between $50,000 and $75,000 board of control. That's an extra transparency, but below $50,000, instead of just below $75,000, below $50,000 is pretty much fair game. We appropriate the money. You could use it to spend for the purposes. You don't need to come back to us or bid for anything extra. So that's the position.
Mr. Chair, I support the rationale you previously spoke about. I would welcome, if we're going to vote after the, at a future meeting or by next Monday, any feedback from the administration on whether monthly, on at least a monthly basis, is the right. We could consider doing that every second month or every quarter or something like that. I don't know if in practical terms how much work is involved. Maybe it's not any work at all because you have in the finance department, there may just be a computerized system which you can export a report on. And so hopefully, the goal here would not be to create administrative workload beyond what's reasonable. So I'd welcome feedback on that point.
And I would be open to that discussion, if whether it's at the 4th, 8th, 12th, 16th, 20th, 24th council meeting that comes
in the future,
some language like that. But I know we're short on time, and
okay, so that's all. I mean, I'd be happy to vote on the motion when you're ready for it.
Okay. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock because I talk too much, and I have to apologize for that. But I appreciate the discussion with the administration, and thank you for your time. If you could go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chair, I think you answered Councilman Rader's question, but just to be clear, the original proposed ordinance, Councilman, had 75,000 limit for both the bidding and the Board of Control. It was only pursuant to discussion and input of the committee members that we now are at 50,000 on the Board of Control, but 75,000 for the bidding, without inflation adjustment to either. So that's the history. Thank you.
Thank you. You go ahead, Director Couture, or you can save it for the next meeting, or whatever you want to do. It's up for you.
I just wanted to add to the discussion that Director Schuster and I did come up with the report. It will be something that's going to be available online for everybody to see there. Just seems overburdensome to finance to put something on the docket every month. We don't ask Chief Dunphy to put on the docket every fire run or every time he takes the police boat or the fire boat out, or Director Leininger to write down every person he talked to about economic development, or Director Dillinger to put down every human resource transaction that she has. This is very rudimentary to finance. And from that point, I mean, just from my perspective, it seems kind of overburdensome. And we did take the time to develop the report. I'll add that nobody in the room really has a bigger stake in making sure that the city has excellent finances than our department. So we don't get those awards, those Auditor of State awards, just by submitting something to the auditor of state. That's a very stringent requirement that we have to meet.
Yep.
It goes to the GFOA. It goes to the auditor of state. After that, there's an investigative desk review from the state's perspective. Our auditors are here 6 months a year. I'm not here just to toot our own horn, but it's a very cumbersome process. I've been in large governments, and I've got that award everywhere, but I haven't gotten it every time. It just doesn't happen every time. It's a lot of hard work and a lot of buttoning down that makes that happen. And we want to have a good shop here. That's what we're always trying to do, and we are trying to make it better. And we do appreciate this because this makes it administratively easier for us from the perspective of the Board of Control. It helps out all the different divisions perhaps throughout the city. I think this part will make it more difficult on finance, for sure.
Thank you.
On the docket.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I'm willing to explore reducing the amount of reports. But thank you, I appreciate all the work you do. And I would say that your department is especially distinguishable from others in that it's the taxpayers' dollars and where they're being spent. And I think the residents have a greater interest in what happens there than mostly anything else.
Yeah,
probably
Mr.
besides
Chair,
safety.
I'll just add, I respect highly the Finance Department's work, and it's a great point. You've been awarded by third-party professionals, but you've been peer-reviewed and awarded multiple times. So it's certain that your work is excellent and is maintained at a standard of excellence. The real spirit of this is aimed not at Department of Finance, it's the spending by all departments simply is routed through. I think to me that's what is the value of this, is that all spending of the taxpayer dollars comes through finance. That's why the ordinance is crafted by naming the Department of Finance, but it's really anything from the other departments that is part of the disclosure. So I want to make that clear that we do appreciate and respect the work of your department and yourself, and it's intended not to express anything negative at all, but just to try to design a system of transparency. And I also think putting on the docket, I mean, this language would require a monthly submission of the same report. Putting it on the docket is not something that should really change the amount of work. But I do appreciate, so we'll get more feedback by next Monday. Thanks, Mr.
And
Chair.
thank you. I'll move to approve that amendment.
Second.
All right. Favor?
Aye.
Aye. And I'll move to defer.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Let's close out. Thank you. Sorry about